The plane was packed, the air thick with anticipation. A hush fell over the cabin as the flight attendants approached a man in the back. He wore a red MAGA hat, the logo gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The man's face was unreadable as the flight attendants spoke to him quietly, but the passengers could feel the tension rising. A few mutters passed through the crowd. Words like, "This is ridiculous," and "should have never let him on." One woman in the row across from the protagonist, a black man in his 30s, whispered sharply, "It's embarrassing that someone like him is even allowed on a plane." The protagonist felt a tight knot in his chest, a mix of anger and confusion. He watched as the flight attendants spoke more forcefully to the man in the MAGA hat. The man didn't argue back, though his expression was filled with silent defiance. Then, as if orchestrated by some unseen force, a voice rang out from the front. "Take him off the plane," someone shouted, their voice trembling with the weight of indignation. There was no turning back. The flight attendants nodded, then gently but firmly escorted the man off the plane. The passengers seemed divided, their whispers growing louder. Some were relieved, nodding in agreement with the decision, while others fumed, angry at the disturbance. But what no one knew, what the protagonist knew, and what none of the others could have imagined, was that the man they were throwing off the plane was Elon Musk. The protagonist had recognized him immediately, but no one else had. The irony was thick, the injustice undeniable. The tension in the cabin intensified as the man's figure disappeared through the door, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The protagonist shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could hear the murmurs, the divided voices of frustration and judgment. He felt a deep, familiar ache in his chest, a reminder of the injustice he had known his whole life. The chaos unfolding on the plane, the people so quick to judge based on something as simple as a hat, felt like a mirror reflecting the world outside. He had lived with this kind of judgment, quick, unfair, and rooted in deep-seated biases. And yet, something about this situation felt different, more unnerving than usual. The man, despite the controversy, was not some random person to the protagonist. He was someone with power, wealth, and influence. Someone who could make the world sit up and take notice. But as he was escorted off the plane, his wealth and influence seemed to crumble away, replaced by the cold sting of racism. The protagonist leaned back in his seat, feeling the heat of the cabin on his skin. He wondered, for the first time, if this world would ever change. What if the man being thrown off the plane hadn't been Musk? What if it had been someone like him? Someone who didn't have the luxury of wealth or status to shield them? The thought left him cold. He turned his gaze to the window, watching the clouds drift by, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily in his chest. He had fought against this feeling his whole life. The feeling that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he worked, the world would always see him differently. Less than. Not enough. And now, here he was, caught in the middle of an event that seemed to echo his deepest fears. The people around him were oblivious to the power struggle unfolding. They were too wrapped up in their own prejudices to see the broader picture. The black man seated among them was more than just a bystander. He had lived this story. Every day, every moment of his life had been shaped by the same dynamics that were at play right now. The flight was an allegory, a reflection of the battles fought on a grander scale in society. He couldn't help but wonder, how many times had he been dismissed for something as trivial as the color of his skin? He had faced discrimination in school, in his job, on the streets. But this felt different. It was a reminder that no matter how much money you had, no matter how much power you wielded, you could never escape the system. A system that didn't care who you were, only what they thought you represented. The protagonist sat still, heart racing, trapped in his own thoughts. The crowd around him was growing restless, and he could feel their eyes on him, each person silently asking the same question. What do we do now? But he knew the answer. There was nothing they could do. The world had already decided. And no matter how much the man in the MAGA hat tried to fight back, or how much he wanted to challenge the status quo, the system would always have the final say. And that, above all else, was the most bitter pill to swallow. The protagonist closed his eyes, bracing for whatever came next, because he knew, just as surely as he knew his own name, that the journey ahead would not be easy. The fight for justice was far from over. The protagonist stared out the window, his thoughts tangled in a web of frustration and anger. The plane's engine roared, but to him, it felt distant. He couldn't shake the image of Musk being escorted off the plane, a powerful man reduced to a mere symbol of defiance. It should have been a moment of triumph, a moment where power clashed with the system. But all the protagonist could feel was the crushing weight of something far more insidious. He had witnessed this type of thing his whole life, the subtle, often invisible ways that black people were marginalized. It wasn't just the blatant acts of racism, the slurs, or the violence. It was the quiet, pervasive discrimination that seeped into every interaction, every decision. It was the look from a police officer when you walked down the street, the way teachers seemed to overlook your potential, the way your boss acted like your ideas didn't matter. The protagonist had lived through it all. And yet, there he was, stuck in a plane, watching a man who could change the world for the better being reduced to the same type of scrutiny he faced every day. He shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the whispers around him. A couple in the row behind him was still muttering about the situation. "I can't believe they let someone like that on the plane," the woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. The man nodded. "Yeah, and look what happened. He got kicked off. Maybe that's what he deserved." The protagonist clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. They didn't understand. They never would. He could almost hear their words echoing in his mind, words that he had heard all his life. It wasn't the first time his race had been the focus of someone's judgment. The protagonist had been a star student in high school, excelling in subjects that others struggled with. But despite his achievements, there was always someone who assumed he didn't belong in the advanced classes, someone who questioned his success. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" That was the question a teacher had asked him when he showed up for the first day of AP English. The teacher had looked at his name on the roster, then back at him, her eyes narrowing. Her unspoken bias was clear. The protagonist had answered with a quiet nod, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in his mind. He had been asked that question countless times, in different forms, throughout his life. He had been told to work harder, speak more clearly, prove yourself, always the assumption that he was not enough, that he needed to prove his worth. It was a constant weight, a reminder that no matter how far he went, how much he achieved, it would never be enough. The protagonist's thoughts drifted back to that moment in high school, the way he had walked through the halls feeling like an outsider. He had been told he was smart, but never in the way they said it about his white peers. It was always a backhanded compliment, one that suggested surprise, as if his success was a fluke. And even now, as an adult, in his professional life, the same invisible forces worked against him. He had earned his spot at a prestigious company, had worked his way up from the bottom, but there were still moments where he felt like he didn't belong. The whispers at work, the sideways glances, the way his ideas were often overlooked until a colleague, usually white, voiced the same suggestion. He had learned to speak up louder, to demand respect, but the silence that followed still stung. No one had ever questioned Elon Musk's position. No one had ever doubted his worth. But the protagonist knew how quickly the system could change. He saw it in every microaggression, every act of discrimination, big or small. It wasn't just about what happened to Musk on the plane. It was about the larger system that allowed it to happen. A system that scrutinized black people, while white individuals were often given the benefit of the doubt. The protagonist felt the anger swell in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He wasn't angry at Musk. He didn't even know the man. He was angry at the system that let this happen. A system that worked tirelessly to push people like him into the margins. A system that had no problem removing someone from a plane because of the hat they wore. And yet, when a white man in a suit committed the same offense, they'd be given a pass. He had seen it happen before. It wasn't just in airports or on flights. It was in the workplace, in schools, in the streets. In every corner of society, black people were treated like they were disposable, like their voices didn't matter. Even in moments when they had the right to speak, when they had the right to exist in a space without fear, the world found ways to remind them that they were never truly free. The protagonist closed his eyes, taking in a slow, steadying breath. He had learned to mask his frustration over the years, to swallow his anger and put on a face that the world would accept. But in this moment, he couldn't suppress it. He wanted to scream at the injustice, to make them all understand what they had just witnessed. But he knew that would never happen. Instead, he sat in silence, his mind reeling. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear to him. This was more than just a flight incident. It was a glimpse into the larger problem, the same problem that kept people like him from rising to the top. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. He thought back to moments in his life when the system had failed him. The time he had been pulled over by a cop for driving while black. The officer had asked him where he was going, what he was doing, as if his presence in the area was a crime. When he had asked why he was being stopped, the officer hadn't responded. Instead, he was told to get out of the car and was given a ticket for suspicion of criminal activity. The same thing had happened when he had tried to buy a car at a dealership. The salesman had assumed he couldn't afford the car he wanted and had shown him cheaper options instead. He had stood there, humiliated, as the salesman spoke to him in condescending tones. It was a pattern, one that he couldn't escape. It was the same feeling he had now. The feeling of being seen as less than, the feeling of being judged before he even had the chance to prove his worth. And it was a feeling that countless others experienced every day. The protagonist had learned to fight back, to speak louder, to demand justice. But the truth was, no matter how hard he fought, it always felt like he was up against a wall. A wall built by generations of systemic racism. A wall that pushed back harder the more you tried to climb over it. But he wasn't going to stop fighting. He couldn't. Not when so many others were counting on him to keep pushing. Not when he knew that the fight wasn't just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. And as the plane continued its journey, the protagonist made a silent vow to never back down, no matter how insurmountable the wall seemed. He wasn't just going to survive the system, he was going to tear it down. The memory came rushing back as if it had never left. The protagonist was a young child again, sitting in the dim light of his living room. His father had just been taken away by the police, handcuffed and shoved into the back of a squad car. His mother's face was twisted in fear, but also in something else, something the protagonist couldn't quite place at the time. It wasn't just worry for his father, but a deeper, more familiar sadness. It was the kind of sadness that had been passed down from generation to generation, woven into the very fabric of their lives. His father had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, a charge that didn't make sense even to the officers themselves. But they didn't care about sense, about fairness. They cared about control, about reinforcing the power they held over the black community. As the squad car disappeared down the street, the protagonist felt a tightness in his chest. It was the beginning of his understanding of the world. He didn't know it then, but the feeling would stay with him for the rest of his life. The anger, the confusion, the feeling of being trapped in a system that worked against you no matter what you did. Days passed, then weeks, and still his father didn't return. The injustice was so clear, so obvious, but no one listened. The local news didn't report it. No one cared to investigate. The protagonist's mother spent hours on the phone, trying to get help, trying to find someone who could help clear his father's name. But no one listened to her either. It wasn't the first time the family had encountered this kind of treatment. It wasn't the first time the protagonist had seen the cracks in the system, the places where the law didn't apply to people like them. The protagonist spent hours staring at the ceiling, wondering why things were the way they were. Why was his father locked up? Why did the police treat their community like they were all criminals? Why was their pain invisible to everyone else? There was no answer, only silence. But in the midst of that silence, there were moments when the community came together. The neighbors, the church members, the family, they all rallied around his mother. They offered help. They offered comfort. And for a brief moment, the protagonist felt something close to hope. They were going to get his father out. They were going to fix this. But that hope was fleeting. It wasn't long before the reality of the situation set back in. His father's case didn't make headlines, didn't catch the attention of anyone with the power to make a difference. The trial was a mockery, a formality. The jury didn't look like him, didn't know his family, didn't care. In the end, it didn't matter how much they fought, how much they proved that his father was innocent. Justice wasn't designed to work for people like them. And as much as the protagonist wanted to scream, to fight, He knew there was nothing he could do. There was no escaping the system. That was a hard lesson to learn, but it was one he'd carry with him forever. He looked up at his mother's face as she sat by the phone, a look of exhaustion etched into her features. Her strength was something the protagonist admired, but he also saw the toll it took on her. The emotional weight of fighting a system that was stacked against them, day in and day out, was crushing. He had learned, over time, that it wasn't just his father who was the target. It was their whole community. The stores they shopped at, the streets they walked on, the schools they attended. None of it was theirs. It wasn't meant for people like them. The protagonist's anger began to grow, bubbling up inside him. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to scream, to make the world see the truth of what was happening. But what good would it do? Who would listen to a black child from a broken home, raised in a neighborhood that no one cared about? That's what the world had taught him. No matter how smart, no matter how capable, he would always be seen as less. He would always be judged by the color of his skin, by the history that had been forced upon him. The years passed, and his father's case faded into the background. The protagonist learned how to carry the anger without letting it consume him. He learned how to survive in a world that seemed determined to break him. But the anger never left. It sat there, deep in his chest, a constant reminder of what had been done to him, to his family, to his people. It made him see the world through a different lens. Everything he did, every decision he made, was shaped by that anger. It wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about everything. The police officers who had pulled over his older brother for driving while black. The teachers who had called him out for being disruptive when all he had done was ask a question. The store clerks who followed him around as if he were going to steal something just because he walked into their store. It was all connected. The system, the injustice, the constant threat of violence. It was all connected. And no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many good grades he earned or how many jobs he worked, he couldn't escape it. His success meant nothing in the eyes of a society that didn't see him as equal. The protagonist didn't understand it fully back then, but he felt it every day. It was a weight that never left. And yet, there were moments, fleeting as they were, when he saw the power of his community. When his mother would cook dinner and they would sit together as a family, the world outside seemed distant. For those moments, everything felt okay. For those moments, they could forget about the battles, the injustices, and just be. But those moments never lasted long. They were always followed by something else, another incident, another reminder that they were not safe, that the world would never let them forget who they were. The protagonist realized, as he grew older, that this wasn't just his struggle. It was the struggle of everyone who looked like him. It was the struggle of every black person who had ever lived in a world that wasn't made for them. And while his own pain was personal, it was also collective. He wasn't alone in this fight. The people who came before him, the people who stood beside him, they were all part of something larger. It wasn't just about surviving the system. It was about changing it. The protagonist knew that his path wasn't going to be easy, but it wasn't about ease. It was about justice, and that was something worth fighting for. The protagonist sat there, his hands clenched tightly on his lap. The events of the flight played out in his mind, over and over again. He had watched, stunned, as Musk was escorted off the plane. His MAGA had a symbol of defiance in the face of a group of people who didn't understand. The discomfort in the air was palpable. But what struck the protagonist the most wasn't Musk's wealth or his political views. It was the way the man's vulnerability had been laid bare, exposed for all to see. For the first time, the protagonist saw someone who, despite his power and privilege, was just as human as anyone else. This wasn't about money or status. It was about something deeper. It was about the raw emotions that came with being forced to confront one's own beliefs and actions. As Musk was led down the aisle, the protagonist felt a spark inside of him, a desire, a need, to do something, anything, that would push back against the injustice that had followed him his entire life. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of this moment, part of this system, and it was time to stop pretending that he was powerless. He looked around at the passengers, some of whom were whispering about the situation. A few were still mocking Musk, laughing at his discomfort, judging him for his politics. Others were quietly uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. But the protagonist didn't care about their opinions anymore. What mattered was the deep-rooted feeling inside him that told him this moment was different. This wasn't about Musk. It was about him. It was about every single moment in his life where he had been told to be quiet, to fall in line, to accept his place. It was about every time he had been told that his voice didn't matter. He could feel the weight of it all crashing down on him now. And in that moment, he knew that something had to change. The decision wasn't easy. The fear that gripped him was paralyzing. He had lived his whole life with the knowledge that speaking out came with consequences. He had seen it happen to others, seen how easily Black people's voices were silenced, their lives disregarded. He had seen friends lose jobs, lose opportunities, even lose their safety, just because they had dared to challenge the status quo. But there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just about what was happening on the plane. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. The years of oppression, the years of feeling less than, the years of watching people like Musk continue to thrive while others, like him, were pushed to the margins. The passengers were waiting for him to react. They were waiting for him to join in, to mock Musk, to fall in line with their judgments. But the protagonist knew that if he did that, he would be complicit in something bigger than the man with the MAGA hat. He had seen this before. He had seen how easy it was to be swept up in the tide of hate and judgment. It was a wave that washed over everything, leaving no room for individuality, no room for dissent. He had spent years learning to navigate it, learning when to keep his head down, when to speak up, and when to walk away. But this time, there would be no walking away. This time, he would stand his ground. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on him like a heavy cloak. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. All eyes were on him now. For a moment, he felt a wave of doubt wash over him. What if they turned on him? What if they judged him too? What if this was the moment where everything fell apart? But then, he looked at Musk, who was still being led down the aisle, his head held low. And something inside the protagonist shifted. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was standing up for every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been ignored or oppressed. It wasn't just about the passengers on the plane, or even about Musk. It was about a system that had been built to keep certain people down, to keep them in their place. And the protagonist wasn't willing to let that happen anymore. With a steady voice, he spoke. He addressed the passengers, his words clear and deliberate. The way we're reacting to this, he began, the way we're treating this man, this situation, it's a reflection of something much bigger, something that's been happening for a long time. The room went quiet. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The protagonist could feel the weight of their eyes on him, could feel the tension building in the air. But he didn't stop. He continued, his voice rising in defiance. There's a double standard here. A system that punishes some people for the same things others are allowed to get away with. A system that tells Black people, that we don't belong. The words flowed from him, a rush of emotion and truth that had been buried for too long. I've spent my whole life watching people like me be treated like criminals, like we're less than. And I'm tired of it. Tired of being silent. Tired of pretending like it's okay. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, some of them clearly taken aback by the intensity of his words. But the protagonist wasn't finished. Don't get me wrong, he continued. I'm not here to defend Musk. But I'm not going to sit here and let this moment pass without saying something. Without standing up for what's right. The silence that followed was deafening. And for a brief moment, the protagonist wondered if he had said too much. But then, he saw something that made him believe in his words. A woman in the back row, who had been quiet the entire time, nodded at him. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. He wasn't alone. In that moment, he realized that his voice did matter. That standing up, even when it was hard, even when it was terrifying, was the only way things would ever change. The protagonist sat back down, his heart still racing, his mind still spinning from the intensity of the moment. But something had shifted in him. The fear, the uncertainty, the anger, it was all still there. But now, it was different. Now, he knew that he had the power to fight back. He had the power to speak his truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made the world around him. And that, in itself, was a victory. The moment his words hung in the air, the atmosphere on the plane shifted. A quiet murmur spread through the passengers, like a wave of discomfort. The protagonist could feel the eyes of everyone on him, as though they were all judging him. He had expected some reaction, but the intensity of the backlash was immediate and fierce. Whispers of troublemaker and instigator filtered through the cabin. It was as though his words had not only broken an unspoken rule, but had violated a much larger, invisible agreement. The moment that had felt like an act of empowerment now felt like a curse. He wanted to hold onto the sense of righteousness, but the sting of rejection was undeniable. As the plane continued its journey, the protagonist sank into his seat, the weight of the situation sinking in. He realized that, despite the defiance he had shown, the world wasn't going to change overnight. In the face of the backlash, he started to question everything. Was it worth it? Had he made a difference? Or had he only made things worse? He had stood up for what he believed was right, but all he had gained in return was alienation. There was a bitter realization settling within him. He was still the other in the eyes of many. Despite his outburst, despite his stand, he was still being treated as less than. The feeling of isolation crept up on him like a dark cloud, blocking out any sense of triumph. Every glance from the other passengers felt like a condemnation. Even the people who had initially seemed supportive now avoided his gaze. The protagonist tried to console himself with the thought that he had done the right thing. He tried to remind himself that change never came without resistance, without sacrifice. But the words felt hollow as they echoed in his mind. He couldn't escape the fact that, in standing up for justice, he had also lost something. He had lost his place among the crowd, his sense of belonging, and his comfort in the status quo. It was as if the very act of asserting his identity had condemned him to a life of perpetual conflict. There was a deep, gnawing feeling inside him, one that told him that speaking out hadn't solved anything. The world hadn't changed. The system hadn't buckled under his defiance. Instead, it had responded with hostility and exclusion. And now, as the plane neared its destination, the protagonist couldn't help but feel like he was back at square one. The emotional toll was heavy. He had always known that fighting for justice came with consequences, but this felt different. He had expected to feel some sense of victory, some relief, but all he felt was exhaustion. The weight of the struggle was real now, and it was more than just the passengers' glares. It was the realization that every battle he fought would be followed by more battles. Every victory would be fleeting, overshadowed by the challenges that came next. As the plane touched down, the protagonist tried to shake off the lingering sense of defeat. But the questions kept coming. Had his defiance been worth it? Had he simply fed into the system he had tried to challenge? He couldn't deny the internal conflict that gnawed at him. It was a battle between what he knew was right and the emotional toll of fighting a system that seemed impervious to change. But amidst the self-doubt, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up. The isolation was painful, but he couldn't allow it to silence him. He had to keep fighting, even when it felt like the world was pushing back harder than ever. He had to hold on to the belief that his voice mattered, even if no one else seemed to hear it. The protagonist didn't want to be a figurehead in a larger battle. He wanted to be a person who made a difference. But the emotional weight of the consequences was heavy, and it was hard to see how his actions had moved the needle. He tried to seek solace in the words of others. Friends and family had reached out, encouraging him to stay strong, to keep going. But it wasn't enough to counter the loneliness he felt in the wake of his decision. The emotional toll was immense. It wasn't just about the fight for justice anymore. It was about the personal cost of standing up for what he believed in. Each step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps back. For every victory, there was a loss. For every moment of defiance, there was a consequence that weighed on him. And yet, despite the emotional strain, the protagonist refused to back down. He couldn't let the small, personal injustices define him. He couldn't let the alienation and fear of the moment determine his future. The fight for justice wasn't just about public victories. It was about resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. And as difficult as it was, the protagonist knew that he had to keep pushing forward. There was no easy answer, no clear path to change. But if he backed down now, He would be allowing the system to win. He would be allowing the fear and isolation to define him. And that was something he couldn't allow. Even in the darkest moments, the protagonist knew that the fight wasn't over. The consequences of his actions had been far-reaching, but they weren't the end of the story. They were just the beginning. The emotional toll was heavy, but he had learned something crucial in the process. Change didn't come without sacrifice, and he was willing to pay that price. It wasn't about the instant gratification of victory. It was about the long, painful journey of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The protagonist didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. The aftermath of the confrontation weighed heavily on the protagonist. He felt scarred, both physically and emotionally, by the backlash that followed his defiance. The world around him seemed colder, less forgiving. But in his solitude, a moment of clarity emerged. It wasn't an epiphany or an easy resolution, but it was a realization. He understood that while the battle against systemic racism would never be won in his lifetime, there was still hope. Hope wasn't something that came from instant victories, but from the quiet persistence of those who refused to give up. In his darkest moments, the protagonist had felt alone. But now, he understood that he was not. He was part of something larger, something enduring. The resilience shown by those who fought for justice, despite the overwhelming odds, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. He found comfort in this truth, even if it didn't erase the pain. He returned to his community, a place that had always supported him, where shared experiences offered a sense of belonging. The people in his life understood the fight in a way no one else could. They had lived it too. They had known the weight of systemic injustice, but they also knew how to rise above it. The protagonist's journey had taken him far, but in returning to his roots, he found the strength to keep moving forward. The incident on the plane, though seemingly small in the grand scheme of things, had opened his eyes. It wasn't just about one person standing up against a wrong. It was about the ongoing war against a system built to oppress. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, was a piece of a much larger puzzle. It was a reminder that progress wasn't linear. It was a series of steps, some forward, some back, but always moving in the right direction. And while that might not bring immediate change, it created a ripple effect that could influence future generations. The protagonist had been reminded of the emotional weight of survival, how it felt to face adversity and keep going despite the odds. It was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life, but he no longer felt burdened by it. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be more battles to fight. But the truth was clear. He couldn't stop fighting, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. There was no illusion that he could end systemic racism on his own, or even in his lifetime. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the fight had to continue, even if the victories were small and the losses were painful. It was about hope and the belief that change could happen, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. The protagonist made a choice. He would keep going. He would not let the system dictate his future or the future of those who came after him. The strength he had witnessed in his community had become his strength. And with that strength, he knew that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. Hope wasn't always easy to see, but it was there, hidden in the quiet moments of resilience and defiance. He understood now that survival wasn't just about enduring the hardships. It was about continuing to push forward, no matter how difficult the path seemed. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And that was where his true power lay. It wasn't in a single act of defiance or in winning a single battle. It was in the ongoing commitment to fight, to stand up, and to never give up. The fight for justice, for equality, for change. These were battles that could not be won with one person, one victory, or one moment. It was a collective effort, a journey that spanned generations. But in the collective strength of people who refused to be silenced, there was always the possibility of change. And that was what the protagonist held on to as he took the next step in his journey. He knew there would be more struggles ahead, but now he was no longer afraid of them, because he had learned that the fight, no matter how difficult, was worth it. He would face the future with courage, knowing that change was always possible, even when it felt out of reach. In the end, It wasn't just about the battles fought. It was about the will to continue fighting, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The protagonist had found peace in this realization, and as he moved forward, he knew that the fight for justice wasn't just something for him to carry. It was a fight for everyone, for all those who came before and all those who would come after. And with that understanding, he was ready to face whatever came next. No matter how hard, no matter how long the road ahead, he would keep moving forward, always with hope in his heart. The final reconciliation was not a resolution of the conflict, but an acceptance of the journey. A journey that was long, difficult, and uncertain, but one that was worth every step. And with that, the protagonist was finally at peace. At peace with the struggle, at peace with the fight, and at peace with the knowledge that the battle would continue. But the fight was not in vain, and it never would be.